Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is going to break a piece of bread and hand half of it to another person, without thinking twice about it. That gesture is older than writing, older than most religions, older than almost every technology we still use today. But what if the wheat that made that bread possible had never existed? What if the plant that became one of humanity's most important inventions had simply failed to evolve the way it did? Because bread wasn't inevitable. It was an accident of biology that happened to occur in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And if it hadn't, one of the most famous moments in religious history would look completely different. Let's start with the plant itself. Wild wheat, before humans touched it, was nearly useless as food. Its seed heads shattered the moment they ripened, scattering grain across the ground so the plant could reproduce. That's great for a wild grass. It's terrible for a hungry human trying to collect it. At a site called Ohallo II on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, archaeologists found grinding stones and wild barley residue dating back roughly 23,000 years. Long before farming existed, people in this exact region were already processing wild grains into something closer to flour. They were priming a habit that agriculture would later formalize. Then, around 11,000 years ago, something rare happened. A random genetic mutation appeared in wild wheat that caused the seed heads to stay intact instead of shattering. On its own, this mutation was a disadvantage in the wild. But it was a gift for humans, because now the grain stayed on the stalk long enough to be harvested in bulk. Early farmers in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent noticed. They started selecting seeds from these mutant plants and replanting them season after season. Within a few thousand years, wild grass had become domesticated wheat, a crop entirely dependent on humans to survive, and humans entirely dependent on it to eat. This is the moment bread became possible at all. Without that one mutation surviving and spreading, wheat might have stayed wild and unusable, just like thousands of other grass species still are today. But here's what's fascinating. Wheat didn't just feed people. It restructured how people lived. Grain could be stored. Grain could be taxed. Grain could be transported. Unlike hunted meat or gathered fruit, wheat gave early societies something they'd never had at scale before. A surplus that could be stockpiled through winter and redistributed through a community. Some archaeologists argue that the ability to store and control grain surplus is one of the direct ancestors of organized government itself. By the time we reach the era of the Roman occupation of Judea, bread wasn't a luxury. It was the backbone of the entire diet across the Mediterranean and the Levant. Studies of ancient dietary remains suggest that grain, mostly in the form of bread, provided somewhere between 50 and 70% of daily caloric intake for ordinary people in the region. Meat was rare. Vegetables were seasonal. Bread was constant. So when a first-century teacher in Galilee wanted to describe something essential, universal, and shared by everyone regardless of wealth, bread was the only object that made sense. It wasn't a symbolic choice made for poetic reasons. It was the most common food object in the entire ancient world available to reach for. Now here's the part most people don't think about. The bread broken at the Last Supper wasn't just any bread. According to the Gospel accounts, the meal took place during Passover, which meant the bread on the table was almost certainly unleavened, made without yeast, in accordance with Jewish law commemorating the Exodus from Egypt. This wasn't a loaf pulled from a bakery shelf. It was flat, thin, and made under a specific set of religious restrictions that had existed for well over 1,000 years by that point. Which brings us to the real question. If wheat had never mutated the way it did, if that one shattering gene had never flipped, agriculture in the ancient Near East would have looked entirely different. So what would have ended up on that table instead? The answer isn't as strange as you'd expect, because the region had other staples competing for the same role. Barley was everywhere. It grows in poorer, saltier soil than wheat, and was actually the more common grain among the poor throughout the ancient Levant. Archaeologists have found that barley bread, coarser and less desirable than wheat bread, was often what laborers and the less wealthy actually ate day to day. Some scholars have pointed out that a rabbi who spent his ministry among fishermen, tax collectors, and the poor may have broken barley bread far more often in daily life than the wheat bread depicted in religious art. Lentils were another possibility. Lentil cultivation in the region goes back even further than wheat domestication, and lentil stew appears repeatedly in Hebrew scripture, most famously in the story of Esau trading his birthright for a bowl of it. Lentils could be dried, stored, and ground into flour for flatbread, just as grain could. Dates were a third option. Date palms grew abundantly around the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley, and dried, pressed dates were portable, calorie-dense, and nearly imperishable, making them one of the most practical staple foods of the ancient desert world. And then there's fish. The Gospels themselves already hint at this alternative. In the feeding of the multitude, the miracle isn't bread alone, it's bread and fish together, drawn straight from the economy of Galilee, a region built around a lake that supplied one of the most reliable protein sources in the ancient world. So if wheat had failed to domesticate, the most likely replacement wasn't some completely foreign food. It was almost certainly one of these regional staples already sitting at the table. Barley bread, lentil cakes, pressed date loaves, or dried fish broken and distributed the same way bread was, becoming the shared meal that defined community in a fishing economy instead of a farming one. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. The specific ritual language used at the Last Supper, take, break, give, wasn't invented for that meal. It echoes an older pattern already present in Jewish table blessings, where the head of a household would break bread and distribute it to everyone present as a symbolic act of unity before a shared meal. The verb itself, breaking, was already loaded with meaning long before that particular night. It represented distribution, equality, and shared sustenance among people who often had very little, which means the deeper symbol was never really about wheat specifically. It was about the act of dividing something whole among many people so that everyone received a portion. Bread simply happened to be the object most consistently available to perform that ritual with, because of one biological accident that occurred in wild grass roughly 11,000 years earlier. If barley had been the dominant grain of the region instead of wheat, the ritual almost certainly survives intact, just with a coarser, darker loaf on the table. If lentils had filled that role instead, we might be talking about broken lentil cakes as a symbol of unity today. If fish had remained the primary staple of Galilee without any grain economy at all, the imagery of division might have centered on dried fish instead of bread, sitting right alongside the loaves and fishes story that already exists in Scripture. The object was replaceable. The gesture was not. And that's really the answer to the question. If bread had never existed, something else in that region would have taken its place, because the underlying human behavior, sharing a limited, essential food source with the people around you, existed long before wheat was domesticated, and would have found another vessel to express itself through. Wheat didn't create the ritual of breaking food together. It just happened to be standing in the right field at the right moment in evolutionary history to become the version of that ritual we remember today. Every time bread is broken and shared, whether at a dinner table, a religious ceremony, or a meal between strangers, it's carrying forward something that started long before agriculture, long before Galilee, long before any single mutation in a wild grass 11,000 years ago. The bread was never really the point. It was just the first thing humans figured out how to divide fairly among everyone at the table.